Good morning, my name's Jacob Furedi. I'm a trainee reporter at the Daily Mail, and welcome to the corruption of political language, the first in a strand of debates focusing on a crisis of political language. This strand is paired with living freedom. The reason we've set up this strand, and in particular this kind of starting session, is because it's pretty clear that the political sphere is a bit of a mess at the moment. We're undergoing serious change, whether it's political language expressed through Brexit or on a more micro level on university campuses, where again we're seeing a new form of politics being laid bare using a new language. So we've got these traditional political terms such as left wing and right wing, which once meant something very different, in the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, as opposed to now in the 21st century. Which suggests that we might be using language in a completely different way. We're also hearing new words, political words, the whole time. If I'd asked my grandma when she was my age what a leaver or a remainer was, she'd have no bloody clue. At the same time, we're hearing completely new words. Who ever heard of the word cis or the gender pronoun Z 20 years ago? We're constantly being faced with a new political language. So I think it's really important that we kind of get to grips with what this political language is. Is it a good thing? Is it, maybe not such a good thing? Do we even have a new political language? What we're going to do is we're going to have a short mini lecture followed by some very incisive comments from a stellar panel of respondents. And then we're going to come straight out to you as per usual. So first of all, we're going to hear from a little mini lecture from Brendan O'Neill, who's sitting over here. Brendan is a long-standing contributor to the Battle of Ideas. He's the editor of Spiked Online. The Guardian calls him the Danny Dyer of journalism, while Andrew Bolt of the Aussie Daily Telegraph says he is one of the world's funniest, fiercest critics of groupthink. Brendan himself has clearly been victim to a certain new political language. Just a couple of weeks ago, he was named in LBC host Ian Dale's the top 100 most influential people on the right, despite the fact that he himself positions himself on the left. It's clear that there's much to be discussed there. We're then going to hear after that mini lecture just some short comments from my fellow panellists. We're going to go straight to Rachel Halliburton, sitting on my immediate left, who is a journalist and novelist. Her book, The Optical Illusion, a Very 18th Century Scandal, will be out early next year. After Rachel, we're going to hear from Dr. Paul Taylor, who is a senior lecturer in communications and cultural theory at the University of Leeds. He's also a bit of a radio titan on the BBC, so I'm sure you've heard him many a time. And then lastly but not least, we've got Nick Hilton sat on my immediate right, who's the broadcast editor at The Spectator. So if you've seen any of The Spectator's videos or podcasts, there's a good chance that they're the brainchild of Nick. So just to get straight into it, Brendan, could you kick us off?
Thank you. If you want to see what a mess both politics and language are in at the moment, you just have to consider the fact that last week Downing Street issued a statement saying it was okay to use the phrase pregnant women. So this is the seat of political power in Britain, informing the populace that it is acceptable to say that women get pregnant. It is acceptable to say that pregnancy is something that happens to a woman, not to a man. And basically, Downing Street is saying it's okay for you to express and give voice to biological facts, which the vast majority of people around the country will have thought was a very strange thing for Downing Street to have to remind us of. Now, of course, this was in response to a controversy involving the Foreign Office. The Foreign Office had to give advice to the United Nations on the wording of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and that covenant contains a line which says pregnant women should not be given the death penalty. And the Foreign Office said, we have a bit of a problem with the phrase pregnant women because it might be offensive to, the 17 people who have given birth while claiming or identifying as men. And so it said to the UN, please say pregnant people to avoid giving offence. And it caused such a stink that eventually Downing Street had to come out and say, look, it's okay to say pregnant women. This is an incredibly bizarre situation that we have to try and get our heads around. Firstly, the fact that the Foreign Office has gone, even the Foreign Office, even the kind of stuffy Foreign Office, which extends Britain's influence around the world, full of suits and civil servants and probably quite boring people. Even the Foreign Office has gone down the rabbit hole of postmodernist trans speech, where even the words men and women are being called into question. And the second bizarre thing, of course, is that Downing Street has to give us a green light that it's okay to say pregnant women, a phrase that people use every single day, and that's how they understand the world they live in. And I think what that story really points to is that we face something really worrying today, a crisis of political language that is actually quite profound and disturbing. A crisis of political language that I think expresses a crisis of politics more broadly, and beyond that, a crisis of meaning, a collapse of meaning, a collapse of the basic categories through which people have traditionally understood politics, the world, and their place in the world. A collapse of the ideas and substance and meaning of everyday life, in essence. So I think the unanchoring of political language, the confusions of political language today, both express and intensify a crisis of public life and even a crisis of common sense. So we actually face something more than what Orwell wrote about in his famous essay, which is not just the misuse of political language, not just the use of political language to mystify rather than clarify and to disguise rather than enlighten. We still have that, of course. We still have the propagandistic misuse of language, but we have something else too, something even worse, a situation where political language has become disconnected from reality and has increasingly become this very crude tool for the expression of narrow, contradictory, mystifying, and even unhinged ideas. So I just want to look at three ways in which I think political language is in crisis today. The first is that thing Orwell and others wrote about, that ongoing, often quite conscious, and sometimes quite sinister misuse of political language to, in Orwell's words, make murder look respectable. We still got that. We still have that. We still have people who very consciously misuse language to hide what they're really doing or to hide what they really think. So this is an era in which peacekeeping is presented to us as something that the United Nations does, something that the British military does, when we know that what they're really doing is war. War is increasingly presented to us as peacekeeping. The United Nations will intervene in a foreign, normally already war-ravaged country. It will often support one side, demonize another. It might even get involved in arming certain groups. It might get involved in raping women, as has happened in certain places where the UN has posted troops. It will inevitably end up entrenching the divisions in that country, intensifying the conflict, deepening the bloodshed, and it calls it a peacekeeping operation. War is now peace. All peace is war. This is an era in which Western governments, the British government and the American government, will bomb other countries and refer to it as humanitarian intervention. That shockingly Orwellian political phrase that was invented by the likes of Tony Blair and much of the Labour Party of the time, which supported him, and also the liberal press, which presented the bombing of Yugoslavia in particular in 1999 as humanitarian intervention. They used the language of caring, saving, humanitarianism, protection, while they were killing hundreds of people, including hundreds of refugees. On more than one occasion, they bombed columns of refugees who were fleeing Yugoslavia and killed them. Women, pregnant women, children, all blown to bits, all of it referred to as humanitarian intervention. A deeply sinister misuse of language. Barbarism disguised as humanitarianism, destruction disguised as construction, as rescue. And then on the domestic front, I think one of the misuses of political language that I find most intriguing and concerning is around the word incapacity, particularly in relation, of course, to incapacity benefit, which is a thing that was introduced in the 1970s, really took off in the 1980s. It's in that decade where the number of people receiving incapacity benefit goes up exponentially and eventually reaches around 1 million. And then in more recent times, incapacity has been reimagined as disability or incapability, and other words get attached to this idea. But that's also incredibly deceitful language. That is the presentation of societal failure, in this instance, the society's failure to provide people with gainful employment, the presentation of societal failure as individual incapacity. The presentation of the limitations of capitalist society and its inability to provide everyone with work as a failing on the part of the individual. It's his or her incapacity that is the problem. And of course, if you look at the 1980s, what happens, hundreds of thousands of people are thrown out of work, particularly in the areas of manufacturing and mining and other traditional forms of industry, and they're redefined as incapable. And they come to think of themselves tragically and inevitably as incapable. And so what we have in those instances, and there are numerous other instances, is the misuse of language, the very sinister misuse of language to disguise what's really going on politically and to cover up war, destruction, unemployment, and other deeply problematic things that happen in modern society. The second way in which political language is in crisis is the way in which some political terms and phrases and descriptions have become so emptied of substance that they now mean the opposite of what they once meant. And there are a few examples of this that I want to give. The first is the word progressive. Whenever I hear someone describe themselves as progressive now, I know that they are not progressive. It's the easiest way to work out if someone's progressive. You can see this all the time. Almost everyone who describes themselves as progressive is actually opposed to progress, is actually largely very uncomfortable with the ideas of the Enlightenment and with the ideas of a future-orientated humanist desire to expand man's influence over nature, to develop the forces of production, to move forward and progress. Even environmentalists call themselves progressive, and you just know they're taking the mick. I've heard people say, we are progressives opposed to fracking. And you just want to shake them by their collars and say, that means you're not progressive. You are opposing a progressive step, a new form of industry, something that could give people employment and create more energy. That's not progressive. The other word that has utterly changed meaning is anti-racist. To be anti-racist now is to be hyper-conscious about race. To be anti-racist now is to think racially all the time. It is to say to people, you're white, you're black, you're this, you're that. It is to behave in the way racist people used to behave, although it's done in a very politically correct way. To be anti-racist now is to go and see a movie in the cinema and count the number of black faces, and then write a Tumblr post later about how terrible it is that Hollywood won't employ enough black people. It is to be myopically racial, obsessively racial. That to me is the opposite of what anti-racist used to mean, which was to get rid of the whole nonsense idea of race. Free speech now means the opposite of what it used to mean. Free speech used to mean you wanted free speech. Now, very often, people will argue for censorship under the guise of freedom of speech. One example of that is Yvette Cooper, who is pushing this thing called Reclaim the Internet, which wants new rules and regulations on the internet so people can't say certain things. And she says this is not about limiting free speech, this is about expanding it. Because if we allow trolls to speak online, other people feel that they can't speak. So in calling for the regulation of speech, she says she is defending freedom of speech. Utterly Orwellian. Censorship is freedom. The other two words that now are emptied of meaning is conservative and Labour. The Conservative Party is no longer interested in conserving things, and the Labour Party no longer knows anyone who labours for a living. The Conservative Party, if you just look at their Gender Identity Act, which would allow anyone to claim to be any gender regardless of reality, looks to me like a complete and utter embrace of postmodernism, a destruction of tradition at its very core. that is the end of any suggestion that the Conservative Party is the Conservative Party. Labour increasingly looks to me like a movement against ordinary people rather than for ordinary people. A movement that wants to police and control what people see and eat and how often they can gamble, and which sees them as a problem to be solved rather than a people to be represented. The left increasingly means being against ordinary people rather than for them, and the Brexit debate proves that too. And then the third and final way in which political language is corroded today is, I think, the most important, which is that political language has increasingly surrendered to the culture wars. Political language is increasingly a tool of identity and validation rather than of description and the expression of convictions. And it's really interesting, I think, that the two of the most common political terms today that are used to describe people are very rarely used by people themselves to describe themselves. And those two phrases are politically correct and neoliberal. I find it fascinating that we see those phrases bandied around all the time. You're politically correct, you're a neoliberal. But it's incredibly, incredibly rare that anyone describes themselves as politically correct or anyone describes themselves as neoliberal. Because that is political language that is not used to describe something accurately, it's used to brand, it's used to other people. It's used in the culture wars, in the identity wars, to say, I'm good, you're evil. It's a marker rather than a tool of description. And you see that again and again today, particularly in the misuse of terms like fascist and communist. So people on the left will call anyone who even remotely disagrees with Angela Merkel's welcoming of 800,000 migrants into Germany, you're a fascist if you have any issue with that whatsoever. You're instantly a fascist. They're like Rick from The Young Ones. Everyone is a fascist. And then on the right, anyone who likes the NHS and wants to expand it and thinks certain things should be done by the government rather than by the free market is a Marxist, a communist, a firebrand. They keep saying this about Corbynistas, and of course it's not true. As someone recently said, Corbynism is basically just microwaved Milibandism. It's not Marxism. That's the key problem, I think, with political language right now, which is that it is increasingly used within the culture wars not to accurately describe yourself or to accurately describe your enemies, but simply to puff up yourself and demonize others. And that gives rise to a situation where it can be very difficult to work out the truth of politics and the truth of where people stand. The one word that is most demonized and which I think we should reclaim is the word populist. That's the word that is the most demonic word today. Everyone who opposes the European Union, a deeply authoritarian, bureaucratic, backward institution, is branded a populist. And in relation to that, I say bring it on. Populist means being interested in and wanting to engage with the popular will. And I think the more that we can reorient politics around doing that, the more we can move away from the dishonest, destructive, self-interested misuse of political language. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Brendan. Lots to mull over. Rachel, any thoughts on that?
When I was asked to join this debate, I just thought straight away it contains infinite topics. So Brendan has already brought up about kind of 9 or 10 massive topics, each of which we could spend the next 1.5 hours talking about. I'm going to respond to a couple of those, but I'm also going to introduce a few new ones of my own. The first thing that I was thinking about, the crisis of political language that we have right now, is I started to look at what's happened over the last 30 years, and it is immense. We are living in such a time of flux. Internationally, we have seen the fall of the Berlin Wall. We have seen history end and begin again. There has been an Arab Spring that then turned to an Arab Winter. And we've also obviously got the global balance of power tipping away from the West and towards Asia. That's internationally. Nationally, we have seen the whole breakdown of the class system, ironically beginning with Thatcher's promotion of the self-determination of the individual. We have then seen centre-ground politics come to dominate England for 20 years, until about 2 years ago when it started to become more polarised again. And on top of that, technologically, we have seen a communications revolution in the form of the internet, which has gone from simply speeding up the transference of ideas, which always has a massive effect, to being able to manipulate elections and bring down regimes. No wonder political language is in crisis. Now, one of the things that you raised in your proposal was you talked about Brexit. You've addressed this. I think we have rather different views from what you've been saying. One of the things that strikes me is the coining of new words in itself, like Brexiteer, Brexit, leaver, Remainer, is not a problem. All these words serve a necessary process. I'm very happy to be told that I'm a Remoaner or indeed a centrist mum, both of which are true. It's the manipulating of old words and phrases to distort debate and create dubious narratives that I think is a problem here. Now, for me, one of the problems is the use of the phrase metropolitan elite. A strong narrative, and one I suspect you use, is that Brexit was a people's revolt against an elite who failed to understand how they had been dispossessed by globalisation and immigration. Now, the thing is, there are splinters of truth in this, but they are only splinters. The moment you start to look in detail at the facts, this narrative starts to dissolve. Now, take the campaign. Did it work because it told the truth to those who had been left behind? Or was it, in fact, because of the backing of a wealthy elite that was happy to break all the electoral rules to get what it wanted? For instance, one of the big stories, much reported in several respectable press outlets, is that a lot of the funding for Brexit propaganda came from 5 of Britain's richest businessmen. These included the notorious Farage ally Aaron Banks, Peter Hargreaves, James Hosking, Robert Ebbston and Crispin O'Dea, who channelled £14.9 million to different pro-Brexit groups. Now, it's often said the super-rich want to stay in Europe, but the super rich do not. Europe allows a kind of free flow of business, but it implies a regulation of capital controls which these people do not want. They want a situation of free trading which can only happen completely for them outside the EU. So they put their energy into making sure it wouldn't happen. More important than this is the fact that offshore companies poured huge amounts of money into databases, breaking all rules of election funding and making absolutely the most of the latest techniques in digital campaigning. Now, the hedge fund billionaire Robert Mercer, part owner of Breitbart, who also owns big data firm Cambridge Analytica, he allegedly, I think we're meant to say allegedly at the moment, aren't we? But he provided free services and advice worth millions of pounds to Farage about harvesting data from Facebook and targeting social media. They then disseminated information to the people who were left behind, reinforcing the message that it was basically Europe and immigration that was their problem. When Leave won, Aaron Banks himself tweeted that it was artificial intelligence that swung it. Okay, you may argue, there might be some truth in this, but you can't deny the connection between those who felt they were left behind and a vote. There is a huge problem with the division of wealth in this country, and that is true. And yes, urban liberals should be getting to grips with that. But it's one thing to acknowledge that truth, quite another to say Europe is the reason that they were left behind. On the most basic level, the year before the vote, European immigrants contributed £20 billion more to the economy than they received in benefits. £20 billion more. Beyond this, the EU itself was founded on the back of a Europe that was on its knees. One of its main aims is to reduce regional wealth disparities. Its key spending priorities are agriculture, because rural poverty was a prime factor leading to fascism, and alleviating poverty in the regions. It awarded €10.9 billion to Britain for the period from 2014 to 2020 for precisely the purpose of alleviating poverty. The Remain campaign was stupid not to point this out, but it is a fact, and it is one of the reasons why I'm passionate about remaining in the EU. Can I bang on about gender politics as well, very briefly?
You can bang on about gender politics later. We're going to come back to you, Rachel. I'm looking forward to it. Paul, any thoughts?
Yeah, I'd like to pick on a couple of things, but just immediately to Rachel's point about the EU. I'll talk about this in a second, but to me, a lot of the debate about the EU was a squabble at an Islington dinner party. And it didn't represent the people that Brendan was talking about. That's one of the problems. And when the EU meets the popular will, it's manifested in women being pulled through the streets of Catalonia by their hair. I think that needs to be recognised.
That's Spain, surely not the EU.
No, I'm sorry, the EU stood by and did nothing, and it's in supporting the Spanish government. But more generally, this theme about Brendan talked about disconnection and respectability. And I can give you just a few examples. about the concept of disconnection. I was behind nearly everything Brendan said, but one aspect that's slightly different but related is not so much the language spoken, but the form in which language is spoken and who gets to speak. So I always find it fascinating with an accent like mine. You never hear in the national media, or incredibly seldom, the issue of class being discussed with a flat vowel. So me and my people have to sit back and hear it discussed by other people. Now, you may think, boo-hoo, but little specific examples. Luciana Berger was parachuted into the Wavertree constituency in Liverpool. Tristram Hunt was parachuted into Stoke Central. Now, if you're from the north of England, the idea that in both of those great cities, Stoke and Liverpool, you haven't got people who can represent your own people. And to exacerbate the problem, Channel 4 News, which I think prides itself on its inclusivity and liberal values, there was an item about northern death rates being off the scale compared to where I am now, the capital of Romania. And as if, so by the way, if you're being annoyed by my northern chippiness, because I was described as that in a previous talk I've given in London, if the death rates are correct, I won't be around that much longer anyway, so you won't have to put up with me. But they were discussing these northern death rates, which actually I think is it's an absolute abomination. And they interviewed Luciana Berger down the line, and Jacob's now working in Liverpool. Just for those who aren't familiar, Luciana is not a name you hear very often in a Wavertree pub. So they're interviewing her about death rates in the north of England, and I'm thinking, well, perhaps the fact you're interviewing a fellow Metropolitan Elite member about death rates in the north of England has something to do with it. There's whole swathes of the country, and I can pick from a Liverpool accent, that's my particular gripe. But if you're from Glasgow, if you're from Birmingham, the only chance you have of hearing that type of voice speaking any type of political language is mostly if you're a trade union leader, who else? A sports person, and a comedian. They're about the only acceptable those accents. And I noticed recently there was a bit of a kickback in social media and in the popular press because of Paul Hollywood, who's probably the exception to the rule, the most powerful Liverpudlian at the moment. On the Great British Bake Off, I, like most people, was really sad to see Liam go. And there was the accusation that Kate only got through because she'd done a really bad version of the Liver Building. But that's one of the few examples I can think of where the Northern power base actually has had any effect. One of the examples I'll give you is, I spend my time reading a lot of dusty philosophical tomes, and there's the famous philosopher from Birmingham, Jasper Carrott. And he once told a joke about, to focus again on this idea of the metropolitan elite, there's an Islington dinner party going on, and very, very posh, everyone's on their best behaviour, and in the middle of it, the family dog barges into the dining room. And I don't know Islington very well, I'm guessing it would be a golden retriever or a Labrador. It's old, it's flatulent, it breaks wind, starts licking its own scrotum, and there's embarrassment across the dinner party. So one of the guests pipes up as the dog's licking its private parts. He said, I wish I could do that. And the hostess archly says, give him a biscuit and you can. Now the point is, it was quite a while ago, but on Question Time, Baroness Chakrabarti, the whole panel was asked, but it was a question about privilege. And in the Question Time panel, she was the only person, it wasn't just a question about Oxbridge, she was the only person on the panel who hadn't been to public school. And there's a question from the audience saying, could you discuss this? And she made excuses. She said, it doesn't matter where you come from. It's, what you mean and what you say, etc. Well, I'm sorry. What she's trying to do as the guest at the dinner party, she's trying to ratchet down the sense of embarrassment. And I think you need people like the host who actually pointedly try and embarrass. And on rare occasions, the curtain falls down and you sometimes see the truth. So Grenfell actually showed people the disparity and the disconnection. Hillsborough would be another one. But the amount of effort or the tragedy that it takes for people to see who does control political language is disgraceful.
Brilliant. Thanks, Paul. There's some really good points there. It's really important to realise that when we're talking about political language, that we're not just talking about language, we've also got to talk about the mouths where it's spouted from. So that's some really good comments there, Paul. Nick, anything you want to pick up on?
Okay, well, working at The Spectator, I have lost countless hours to Brexit already. So, and I do think any discussion about Brexit, you inevitably forget what you're supposed to be talking about, which I guess is a crisis in political language, as outlined by Brendan. And it's misleading that I work for The Spectator and I'm actually the kind of the soft liberal voice. And in addition to doing the podcast and the videos and stuff, I also am sort of the sounding board for all discussions about identity politics and sort of the great staunch defender of identity politics, which I guess will be my role here. So, I mean, the central, the catalyst for Brendan's mini lecture was this question of pregnant women, pregnant people. As I recall the story, it was actually, the language change is actually from expectant mothers to pregnant people, which is, again, and this is a kind of question, again, about semantics. For me, pregnant people is more precise a definition than expectant mothers. There are various questions about expectation, about mothering, about whether that, someone who's pregnant is going to carry the child to term, etc., etc. And, it's a sensitive issue, and pregnant people seems to me in this circumstance the more precise scientific definition. Which comes to misuse. I mean, I don't know if Brendan was trying to say that saying pregnant people is a misuse of language or a slight misrepresentation. But if you constantly reject identity politics, constantly reject kind of the gender discussions that are being happening, and I'm going to have to use quote marks liberal. I'm told I'm not allowed to say liberal as Spectator. Apparently means different things on the right and the left. But anyway, the most demonstrable misuse of language that I heard in Brendan's mini lecture was to call everything you don't understand postmodern, as though, I don't understand it, it's happening with young students, it doesn't make sense to me, it's postmodern, yada, yada, yada. So identity politics is not postmodern. It's a very real discussion that should be had and should be debated. People are very keen on free speech, but don't actually want to debate the issue, just want to call it postmodern, labelling it as postmodern. And so I guess we're going to get dug into identity politics later. I know that Rachel said she wanted to get onto it. But to touch upon the next one, the next point that Brendan raised, kind of the emptying of substance of these terms. He doesn't like anyone who describes himself as a progressive is not progressive. I'm slightly baffled by the idea that anti-fracking cannot be progressive, because it is not, as though progress is somehow linear, and if we develop a nuclear weapon and not dropping that nuclear weapon is not progressive. Nuclear disarmament is not progressive. All these things can't be progressive if they're not moving inexorably forward. And then Labour versus Conservatives. I mean, I'm not to bring out my card-carrying Labour member thing this early, but the idea that the Labour Party is not in touch with people who actually labour is, again, just this willful misrepresentation of the Labour Party, the trade union and movement. I don't know if Brendan has actually been to local CLPs in the regions and actually spoken to people there, and I think they would be frankly baffled by the idea that what the work they do is not Labour. And it just seems so odd to me in a discussion about political language where you are starting by saying people misusing political language, people are emptying it of substance, to then make these wild claims that seem to be backed up by absolutely nothing, to focus entirely on these kind of weird semantic detours, rather than the actual issues about like binaries and polarizations of political language, the discourse we had. And I got like a minute, so just one word on Brexit. I mean, the problem with political language in Brexit, for me, started at the ballot box with the way that question was worded. I mean, very literally, I should have researched this, but it was something like, should we exit the European Union, yes or no? And you were given a yes or no answer. So, of course, the arguments there were going to be completely polarised, because you had just a yes or no answer. If you had yes, but we want EA, rough deal, or yes, we want a Canadian-style deal, yes, we want to go on WTO terms, etc., or no, no, it's kind of simple. But it was an unnuanced question phrased on the ballot paper, and obviously it produced an unnuanced discussion. And that's so true of our political discourse. If we narrow it down to these simple binaries of saying, you're either progressive or you're not progressive, you're either liberal or you're not liberal, then, of course, we end up with these arguments which is kind of like knife fights, rather than kind of the nuanced discussions I assume we're going to have now, Jacob.
Hopefully, fingers crossed. Thanks very much, Nick. Before I come out to the audience, Brendan, lot there to pick up on responses to your speech. I just want to pick up on maybe just one point. So clearly we've got whether Brexit was a result of the corruption of political language.
Brexit, I could talk about Brexit for the rest of my life. Brexit is the best thing that's happened in British politics for 50 years. I think just one point I would make, which might become two really quick points. The first one is if we are having knife fights, as Nick says, over issues of liberty and democracy and so on, which is the substance of the question of what it means to be liberal, the question of what Brexit means and so on, that's good, that's great. I'm all for binary conflicts of interest and discussion and debate over those matters of substance. They're incredibly important matters. The problem with identity politics is that it's the intense politicization of personal life and lifestyle and skin color and gender and all those things, which means that the debates become incredibly poisonous and destructive. And then the binary becomes really, really dangerous, I think, because it becomes, I'm a good person, you're a bad person, I will dehumanize you. You don't count. Then it becomes really, really problematic. If we got politics back to its substantial ground of liberty and democracy in the future, then the debates can be as intense as you like, and they'd still be fruitful. Just on Labour, quickly, Labour is a joke. Labour is a joke. If you just look at the membership in particular, the membership is increasingly from social classes A and B. I think Paul is absolutely right that you cannot switch on the TV these days without seeing a posh Corbynista talking about the issues of class. They never really mean class politics in any progressive revolutionary sense. They mean looking after the vulnerable, which is another modern political phrase I really dislike. The vulnerable, by which they mean poor people and working class people. It's an incredibly paternalistic movement. It's the social makeup of its membership and its leadership has changed dramatically over the past few decades, and that's reflected. That it both reflects and also intensifies the policy decisions it makes, which increasingly are about looking after the vulnerable rather than liberating people from poverty, providing people with gainful employment, and so on, which the Labour movement used to be about.
Brilliant. So Rachel, I want you to quickly come back on the identity politics stuff. Then Nick, do you want to come back and briefly on a bit of Labour bashing? Sure.
Yeah. So I'm not going to bang on about Brexit anymore. So gender, I have to admit I was slightly at sea on this, and I decided I'd do some research on economic and social conditions that perhaps promote notions of greater fluidity in gender, and I realise it is so far from being a postmodern condition. In fact, this notion of completely binary genders is something that has been enforced by Christian culture for centuries. If you look around the world, in India, famously, you got the Hijras, males who take on traditional female roles and expectations, but they occupy their own territory as a third gender. They have suffered huge amounts of discrimination, but in 2014, India recognised them as a third gender by law. Native Americans have always recognised a third gender called two-spirited. They can be men who dress as women, women who dress as men, or androgynous individuals. They're revered as healers and caregivers. There's even the people of Sulawesi in Indonesia. They recognise 4 genders and a 5th metagender. The Bisu, these are neither male nor female. They are born hermaphrodite. Also, just generally, if you read historical accounts, there are so many examples of kind of gender fluidity. I mean, my favourite one recently was the story of May Morris, the incredibly talented daughter of William Morris, who some now think responsible for some of his designs. Now, earlier in her life, she had a relationship with George Bernard Shaw, but towards the end, she spent her later life with a woman called Mary Lobb, a Lang girl, who looked and dressed like a man. They lived together as a married couple. This was in the 1920s and the 1930s. Gender has always been a complex thing. Our culture has tried to make it simple, and I think, the fact is it is more complex than we narratives have allowed for, and finally it's breaking out. Okay. The one final thing I would say,
Rachel,
pregnant, you've got to say pregnant.
Rachel, come back to that later.
Okay.
No,
I do think you had to say pregnant women, though.
Okay. I'm sure we'll come back to pregnant women. Nick, bit on the Labour Party.
Okay, well, I'm sort of handicapped immediately by the fact that the moment I defend Jeremy Corbyn, I become the sort of posh Corbynista that Brendan is. decrying. So I'm not going to do that. All I would say is that if you do think the Labour Party is just Posh Corporations, just James Schneider and Seamus Milne and all the kind of Westminster crew, then you're not engaged in the Labour movement at its grassroots. And I do think, and it's a boring cliche to say about this election, but this election was the election was not. It was not won. The election was better than it should have been by the fact that young people were getting out, working class people were getting out, and actually, I mean, if it was just kind of, people who went to Westminster and St Paul's, it would have been a much smaller group of people voting.
But I talked about the membership, not the voting base.
You think? I mean, do you have demographic breakdown of the membership, which says they're all privately
We're not getting into demographics.
79.
That's really boring.
79%.
Hands up if you want to speak.
There's something deeply ironic about people who say, it'd be so terrible that we have divisive politics nowadays. If you were to at any point say that you're against gay marriage, I believe that the standard response was shut the fuck up. You have to remember that, and actually I don't mind being told to shut the fuck up if you disagree with me about whether or not there should be gay marriage. So let's not kid ourselves that politics and things that you believe in are not important and are not going to divide opinion. Just to add salt to the wound of the politically correct language, I'm wondering at what point we're not allowed to say pregnant, since it implies that a woman or whoever has been impregnated through the act of a man penetrating her vagina. So, it's
sperm donors.
It's a very slippery, of course, but it's a very slippery slope that you get into when you start trying to unpick these sorts of things. And guess what? They turn into screaming matches between people who say that you're not allowed to say pregnant this or pregnant that.
Actually, my question was about your point about representation. So my personal opinion would be that I haven't ever seen a politician that really represents anybody that I can think of. I think politicians represent themselves, and they're best at putting forward their own self-interest for political gain.
Brendan, I was very struck by the stance that you took, and I really enjoy a lot of your work, and you always present an important kind of radical or revolutionary voice, a progressive voice in this, I think, the positive sense in which you would use it. But what I was struck by was by how conservative your position actually is. The idea that our language is corrupt, or that we live in a time where our language is uniquely corrupt, is I think, just historically false. The beginning of philosophy is reflected in Socrates being accused of corrupting the youth, corrupting language. The sophists were accused by Plato of using false or corrupt language. The idea that language is stable or persists over time or endures is always an argument that's used by oligarchs, conservatives, those who are afraid of change. Now, yes, we must be worried of abuse or misuse of language, but language itself is ambiguous rather than corrupt. It reflects the fact that politics, or the human condition, is itself inherently conflict-ridden, and our language reflects that fact. That's not a sign of corruption or crisis or degradation. That's a reflection of the reality of being human.
Where does all this line come from? Right, fascism. What is fascism? It's Marxism, sans internationalism. Stalin said, in a nutshell, his politics was socialism in one country. Left's been lying about things way before that. As Brendan knows what I'm going to say now, identity politics, it began with Central European intellectuals couldn't work out why the Western workers weren't rising up when they had in Russia, right? They used a totally non-scientific idea from Freud, repression. Capitalism repressed the workers. So the head of the household, male, he repressed his wife and kids. They took on, wedded that with ideas from Engels and got this idea that the big problem is not class, it's men, women, right? All those intellectuals went across to Columbia University, it all filtered down to the States. Then you got the new left running with the idea in 68 and 69 that there were sort of these sort of pseudo-Marxist revolutions to do with civil rights and Stonewall. And it's from 1970 onwards, he got this idea of the triumvirate of the victim classes of non-male, ethnics, etc. The left has consistently, completely lied about this, and this is why we're in the shit we are in at the moment.
Just about what you were saying about it being the tool of the oligarch. You've only read part of the history book there, mate. When anybody is bent on totalitarianism, from whichever part of the political spectrum it comes, this is the first tool they take out the box: censorship. You can't say that. Right. Because it's a hop, step and a jump from you can't say that, just because I disagree, to you can't think that in the first place.
I'm going to come
And
back
the
to
link between those two things, it's the first tool any totalitarian takes out the box. It doesn't matter who they are or where they come from or what flag they wave. So it's a very dangerous thing to say that you can't say that.
Risk of developing a bromance with Brendan, but very quickly, the point about binary options, if you're going to start saying it was a binary referendum, we didn't get asked to go in. And in the 1970s referendum was a binary, should we stay in or should we go? So please, all I want is some intellectual consistency. Again, I repeat the stuff about the argument is Labour isn't disconnected. My alma mater's Edinburgh. If you just said to me in my lifetime, Labour could become irrelevant in Scotland, I'd be absolutely shocked and I wouldn't have believed you, but they have because they've become completely disconnected from their roots. And the point about self-interest, I'm not so sure so you can make such an easy distinction. My point would be the clear segue between self-interest and class interest. Back to my mate Tristram Hunt. He parachuted into Stoke Central, didn't like it when the Labour Party became a bit more like what the Labour Party was always supposed to be. Guess where he went off to? Director of the Victoria and Albert Museum. Well, his self-interest is very similar to the class interest that allowed him to get that job. I couldn't get that job. Most of the people in this room couldn't. Complete fix-up. And that's the type of thing that just never gets spoken about.
Brilliant. And Nick, just one point.
To that point?
No, any of the points were just one. So.
Oh, God. The first guy who said that I should tell him to shut the fuck up, which is my default response to a lot of questions. But no, I thought it was an odd point to raise because I don't think anyone on the panel actually said we shouldn't be having divisive arguments and we shouldn't, we should be kind of telling people to and this, I guess, the broader point about censorship is that it seems a sort of odd fixation of people like Brendan and people who are on the right, people who are very critical of students, to be like fixated with the idea that students are censoring as though students have the power to censor, as though anyone but the state can censor. They can remove a platform. They can say to people, you can't come speak to us. I could say to you, you're welcome to your view that you shouldn't have gay marriage, but you don't have to come and say it to me and my friends at our Islington dinner parties. So I mean, I guess that's a broader point about censorship. Is often actually, again, it's misuse of language. Things are not actually being censored. Things are just being rejected by certain communities because that community has no interest in that view. And that's not a bad thing. Every community does that.
Right, Rachel, do you want to come back just one point?
Yes. I just want to pick up, actually, tangentially on the point made by the gentleman up here about ironically, about the link between censorship and totalitarianism, because obviously kind of one of the other things you raised, it was about fascism, what you call fascist. And something I was just kind of noticing looking out over Europe. I mean, obviously you have your overtly fascist groups such as the Reichsbürger fascism in Germany or Golden Dawn in Greece. But fascism does start subtly, and often it is to do with saying that certain opinions cannot be held. You have, Viktor Orban in Hungary, the debate is split on him. But one of the first things he's done is to clamp down on journalists. They've been attacked trying to cover the refugee crisis. Newspapers and blogs have been closed down. We find it very easy to condemn this in other countries, but I think we need to look at ourselves just as hard about what can be said and what cannot be.
Brendan, do you want to pick up on one point?
I think Nick just gave a very good example of Orwellian misuse of political language. We're not censoring, we're just removing your platform, which basically means that in that particular place where you were invited to speak to a particular group of people, you can no longer do it. And that's happened to me on a couple of occasions. And I felt censored because I couldn't speak to the 100 or so people who wanted to hear me speak. I want to just make a point about the elite, because Rachel was suggesting earlier that and a lot of people say this now, that even the use of the word elite is misleading. And whenever I say the word elite now, people think you're a fascist. People think the only people who've ever talked about elites in the past are fascists. If you talk about the elite and the people, that's immediately suspect. They overlook the fact that so many radical movements in the past and revolutionary movements have also used the same language. But the thing that I find interesting is who creates a lot of the language that gets used today. It's not created by ordinary people. It doesn't come from everyday conversation. Words like post-truth, cis, as someone said earlier, gender fluid, these aren't normal everyday words. You will not hear these words in the pub. You will not hear them at bus stops. These are the inventions of an elite. And they are words that are created, they are language that are created to control not only how we express things, but fundamentally how we think about things. And then fundamentally on from that, how we behave and how we act in the world. I think someone said that the control of language is a very authoritarian instinct. I think that's absolutely right. And it's the control of language with the end of controlling thought. We should always be immediately suspicious when words are censored or when new words are invented. One of my favourites is the word smoke freedom, which was actually turned into one word, which was very newspeak, so the ban on smoking in public places was presented to us as an extension of freedom, whereas anyone who's honest with themselves will know that it was a limitation on freedom. It limited people's right to choose whether to go to a smoking establishment or a non-smoking establishment. But then we had this creation of this one squashed together newspeak word, smoke freedom, a word no one uses, but was created by the elite to present authoritarianism as liberty. We should always be very critical of that and question who's creating this language, why are they using it, and why are they pressuring us to use it as well.
It's a question to Brendan. It'd be useful to get a sense of what you think the mechanism would be to have a more precise language. So the reason I say that is in the democracy that I live in and have lived in, and political sort of language, meaning has often been sort of contested. And I agree that there's more of a drive that's top-down about what language people use. And I think part of the problem seems to be, to me, that in terms of working class sort of politics, coming to what Paul was sort of commenting on, I don't have a strong sense of the agency of what we would have called the working class. So when we talk about the 17.5 million, I don't see them revolting. I agree that it was a historic thing, but I don't see them reacting to what's going on around them. So I think that's a bit of a problem. One thing that is a question, it'd be useful if you could be precise, Brendan, about what would be an anti-racist sort of position now.
Kerry Dingle from the education charity WORLDwrite. I really like your last point, Brendan, and surely within that new political language is the assumption, particularly you see it in relation to gender, that the mass of us are stupid, contemptible, awful, and that a lot of that language is about the sort of virtue signalling which separates you off from the deviant mass whose behaviour must be reformed or kept out of politics, and that would seem very evident to me. But I wanted to ask you, you ended your point with saying we should and can and must reclaim the real meaning of populism as supporting and popularising the popular will. But do you think within political language, given so many words have now been so degraded in their meaning, that we can reclaim and make something of them? So, for example, class, which would seem to me to now be a categorisation of you as, you know, disadvantaged, stupid, weak and vulnerable. Is it therefore use? When a lot of people use class, that's what they mean. When people talk about equality, they don't mean it as I've always understood it, as we want everyone to be rich. They mean we don't like rich people, wealth, consumption, and we don't like poor people because they drink, smoke, and eat too much. So can those words ever have a progressive meaning again? Or lastly, can we reclaim the idea of Europe from the idea of the EU, which are so wrongly and badly equated, one being wholly reactionary and one being a lot of citizens with much in common?
Yeah, I think I'd like to hear a bit more from the panel about how words are being used to create a certain political approach. So it seems to me that lots of words are used to not project an idea, but to suppress the discussion of that idea. So just two examples. So we hear a lot of people being called out. Now, if you call somebody out, you're assuming that you're right to start off with, and that you have the authority, and the only appropriate response for somebody else is to feel shame. So that takes out the context of a discussion. You're not criticising an idea. You're calling somebody out and expecting them to feel shame. So you're not projecting your idea. You're denigrating your opponent, and you're shutting down the opportunity to discuss those ideas. And there's lots of language that's being used in that very politically aggressive way that doesn't sound politically aggressive. Another great one is denier. So anyone who's a denier, for example, a climate denier, is avoiding something. If you're denying something, you're avoiding facts or the truth or something. You're also a failure. You're psychologically flawed. And therefore your ideas can be ignored. So a lot of language is being used in a way not to project something, not even to project the concept that you're trying to put forward, but to shut down free speech and shut down an opponent. And I'd like to hear a bit more from the panel, apart from talking about the Labour Party and Brexit. Let's talk more about language and how language is actually being used.
I actually want to try and return this discussion to something that Brendan began with, which I don't think people are interrogating enough, which is this point about the crisis of meaning. Because I think all of this stems from that very fact that we do have a crisis of meaning. And in particular, the historic position we're in is where the elite have lost faith in their system, in everything that they stood for in the past, and the belief, and all this other stuff that's happening, all this discussion about identity, all of it, is just filling the vacuum that has now been vacated by them. And the problem with this is whether you believe any of this unhinged thinking about men can have children, and it's like we're living in a Monty Python film. That's really irrelevant to me, because the critical thing is that the crisis of meaning and the language that we now use, and we are being forced increasingly to adopt, is actually closing down the human imagination. Because if all that's left is that we can talk about things that are natural, our naturalized identities or our assumed identities or whatever, we're actually closing down what we think of ourselves and our potential and of our ability to shape the world around us. So we're closing down the human imagination. And the problem I've got with this is that there's a lot of very positive impulses around. We see it in Brexit. We see it across Europe in terms of some of the elections, the results, where people are saying they've had enough. And it's not just because they simply see themselves as victims. I think there's an aspiration for change. The problem is that there's no language that can give shape to that can actually inspire more and more people and cohere this into a proper political opposition to what exists today. And so when we talk about the political language, for me it's about what political language can we discover, invent, that can actually give shape to real aspiration that can bring about real change.
Nick, any thoughts?
I'm just going to return briefly to what Brendan said.
Very briefly, and then come
very
back.
Briefly, my God. Brendan, if you're invited to speak somewhere that 99.9% of the population would not be invited to speak at, and then that invitation is withdrawn, that is not the same as censorship. And to think it is to conflate that with like Stalinist censorship is this, you would call someone else a snowflake for their hurt feelings. I mean, that would be, this is a sort of coddling that I don't understand. Just to quickly go to the crisis of meaning. I mean, you've talked a lot about these nonsense ideas that men can have whatever. And we've brought up cis and, pronouns, non-gendered pronouns, etc., etc. No one has ever been forced to use these pronouns. No one is saying you need to use these pronouns. It's
okay. You can put your hand up. Get out. Okay, so there'll be lots of hands going up next time. Okay, then.
Well, I got a compelling response to that. It's like the UN document, which is it's a UN document. It's not saying that you cannot say pregnant woman. It's not saying pregnant mother. It's just saying that official UN documentation should say pregnant people rather than expectant mother. And the same is true. I mean, if you meet someone who would prefer that you use non-gendered pronouns, you should use non-gendered pronouns. But equally, there is no one going around policing your use of pronouns. And if you think there is, you are wildly deluded, because the majority of people do not even never heard the word cis. I mean, at the Battle of Ideas, we've all heard the word cis. We actually all understand the word cis. But the majority of people have never heard it, and it is not imposed on people at all. And to act like there's some sort of crisis of meaning is to just be like, I am uncomfortable with the content, the ideas that cis denotes. The word itself is we understand the meaning of it, and no one is forcing you to use it.
Great. Right. I think that outburst shows there is a bit of a crisis of political language. That was very interesting. Rachel, do you want to come back on just one point?
Yes. I'm going to come back, actually, I'm going to come full circle. I started by picking up on the notion of elite, and obviously that's a word that has come up a huge amount in this discussion. And I actually just want to kind of throw the question back, well, to you. And the elite has been described as everything from the people who designed the word smoke freedom, which is an absurd word, I agree, to those who kind of debate Europe at Islington dinner parties. I mean, elite is just kind of used as this kind of block for people we resent. I'd just like you to ask you to break down what exactly you mean by elite.
People who have power. And, for example, the BBC I've had dealings with is more incestuous than a 15th century Norwich. That's what I mean.
Good line.
Paul, on that, do you want to come back to...
Yeah, so the point about the crisis of meaning, I think is an interesting one, but I'd politely just disagree in the sense that, as was made since Plato, and the English language is one of the most agile languages, it borrows from everywhere. It's not about language, it's who gets to speak. And also, so if you use the phrase safe space, ironically, this is a safe space for obnoxious views. And it's civility is an underestimated, it's the concrete that keeps the edifice together. It's about basic cultural civility. Can people speak, listen to each other and disagree? And the problem with meaning, it's not a crisis of meaning, it's just that the people who have access to speech are in an echo chamber talking to each other. In my local pub, if someone's acting prissily, the phrase uses, have a chat with yourself. And then the conversation moves on. You don't get these meta-philosophical debates about the crisis of meaning. It's not that complicated.
Brendan, is the crisis of meaning complicated?
There is a crisis of meaning. I think the way I understand it is in relation to the question of identity politics and the new identity language, is that there was a time not that long ago when people would derive their identity from very concrete, solid, usually public forms of life. You know, you would define yourself through politics. You were left or right, socialist, whatever. You would define yourself through your work. You were, whatever work you did, that would be your definition of yourself and your engagement with the world, or through religion, through your church, through some form of public life. That's how people understood their place in the world and really understood themselves. It wasn't the only thing. Of course, people had a private life as well, but that was an incredibly important part of identity formation. And with the corrosion of all those things, with the emptying out of politics, so it all seems very samey to us now, the corrosion of public institutions, the decline of trade unions, the decline of work as a good or useful thing, the decline of all those kind of old public institutions which used to give us meaning, means that identity politics becomes a far more introverted, navel-gazing thing. And so then you get the obsession with the body and the obsession with genitals and these young people looking at where they are precisely on the gender ruler. Am I here? Am I there? And it can change from one day to the next. That's where you get the idea of fluidity, gender fluidity. The fluidity expresses the lack of any concrete means through which you might define yourself in relation to public life. So there is a crisis of meaning. It does give rise directly to this confusion of who we are and what words we can use. I really am fascinated by the phrase, I identify as, which sounds so contingent and changeable and flabby. You know, in the past you would say, I am a Catholic, I am a shoemaker. You know, you were confident of who you were, you knew who you were. Now I identify as a woman, or I identify as disabled, or I identify as someone who's a student, whatever it is, it suggests a lack of confidence in what you are. You identify as it today, but you might change your mind tomorrow. So that, I think, really sums up the crisis of meaning. And I think that's why this has got to be about more than pulling people up on the words they use, although, you know, I'm all in favour. I agree with the person who said calling out culture is really problematic, but I do think we need to think about where language is coming from and why we're pressured to use it. But beyond that, we have to think very carefully about how to inject greater meaning into public life and how to recover that sense of public life through which people might cultivate a more substantial identity rather than the sometimes brittle, quite bitter, quite censorious identities that people are creating at the moment.
Thanks, Brendan. This is a really useful point. I mean, if we're going to accept that there is a corruption of political language and there is a crisis in political language, it'd be good to hear from people if they've got any solutions. You know, how can we go about saving it, if that's possible?
I think the shift has been from whether we think we are fundamentally equal, but within that we can celebrate our differences, or whether we see ourselves as fundamentally different, if you're fundamentally different, there is no necessity for equality. And so actually identity politics becomes a dead end because it does not imply equality, whereas equality can allow difference. And I think that's where the problem arises.
I was just going to ask about language in relation to action, because somebody said dropping nuclear bombs is not progressive. But actually, nuclear power was progressive. And what you did was you attached nuclear power to the action of dropping a nuclear bomb. And it just struck me that one of the issues that exists at the moment is that you're only allowed to act within certain language. So if you're working class and you live on the Grenfell estate, you are a victim and you have to use the language of victimhood in order to get something done. The same with Hillsborough. And the same in most working class areas. You need to show that you're a victim of something as opposed to somebody positive. And I just wondered what people thought about that idea that actually, the one that really struck me was when the Labour Party lost the election and the Twitterati spent their whole time telling everyone to vote. But they didn't mean vote. They meant vote for the Labour Party. But they just, and then they were shocked when the language they'd used, vote, meant that people actually voted in the way that they wanted to vote. So I think the language that's used is usually an order to a particular type of action.
Nick, sorry. Okay, two things I want to call you up on. One, governments policing pronouns, maybe not in this country, but look up Canada, Bill C-16 and compelled speech. If you're not aware of that, look it up. There's a guy, Professor Jordan Peterson, at the University of Toronto who's gone, just look him up, YouTube. Second thing, correct me if I'm wrong, but you tried to play down the link between postmodernism and identity politics, right?
I said, yeah.
You did, okay,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah,
I have a reasonably well-developed counter-argument to that, but rather than hog the mic as my own mini lecture, I'd like you to expand on that, and we can talk later if you want.
That's great. Very ominous. Right in front.
One thing that I think's not really come out of the debate quite yet is kind of the way in which politicians talk to or give speeches, not necessarily in the way that they say you can't say this and you can't say that. It's more of the way we kind of have this like clickbait, soundbite politics, and when you look at like some of the academic analysis that's gone around it, there's a piece someone talked about Abraham Lincoln. When he gave his speeches, he was giving them to a reading age of like 16 or something like that. And when George Bush was doing it, he was given to a reading age of 8. And people have done similar things with Trump. I don't have any UK examples, but I'd be interested in hearing why the panel thinks that not just that politicians tell us what to say and what not to say, but why they talk down to us in the way that they do.
When we talk about students, you always talk about students who like talk about identity politics and they tell everyone to shut up and like they don't let people come in. Being on a campus way too often in the week, I just don't see this. We always have this conversation about students doing this, students doing that. Like, personally, I find identity politics really interesting. I'm not going to tell you to shut up. I'm not going to be like, that is such a small minority of people, and I do think they're a problem, but like, we never have a deep discussion about freedom of speech on campus. Like, for me, if I wanted to talk about identity politics, my issue with freedom of speech isn't like censoring others. It's about prevent and things like that censor me. That is legislated censorship in campus, but we always talk about students who tell you, oh, stop talking. That, and I agree, I don't really think that's censorship. Like, you're doing, for example, when Nick made that comment and everyone heckled, I don't mean like heckled as in you having to go, but you were like, oh. If you went to a room of students and the students went, oh, that would be an article of, oh my goodness, these students, blah, blah, blah. I said cis, and I didn't say cis, and they went, oh, and that affected my freedom of speech. But this is what everyone does. People are human, people get emotive, people get angry, and people say things. But when you're a young person, I feel like if you're like, oh, everyone's like, oh my goodness, look at them. I cannot talk, I cannot say what I want. Like, this is such a minority of people, and I don't understand why that has to dominate a whole discussion about race, about gender, because somebody somewhere on a campus stupidly said, can you stop talking, or I don't want that speaker to come. And this is so rare. Like, there are so many other bigger issues out there. And I'm not saying it's not an issue or trying to downplay it, but I think that we focus and fixate so much on a small group, and we've brought all students with it, so everything that comes out of a campus and things like prevent and things like that get completely overlooked.
It's one of the rare occasions I really want to agree with Brendan in terms of what's causing this crisis. That, you know, as I also said at the beginning, we are a society in massive flux. This breakdown in the notion of how we define ourselves through class, jobs and religion is inevitably going to create some kind of, language is going to scrabble to keep up with that. However, I don't think that this is a bad situation. Now, Paul, you say you leaf through lots of dusty philosophical tones, so you'll be more than familiar with the concept of aporia, a state of confusion. And it's something that originally comes up in Plato, and the idea is, many of you will probably know that when Socrates has had a lengthy debate with his interlocutor, that person is then confused about their original ideas. Aporia literally means without resources. This is not, though, a negative thing. This is a dynamic condition, and what happens as a result of this state of confusion is you then look for a better way of defending what your ideas are, what your sense of who you are. So I'm not seeing a crisis in language here. I mean, we have a room full of people who are very energised about all these terms. What they are in fact doing is provoking further debate, and that's the kind of society I want to live in.
Right. Paul, very quickly, I want to go out again, so can we keep it to...
Yeah, one very immediate point is that the issue about people not being allowed to speak or whatever, I'm just slightly confused because I think Jermaine Greer was recently no-platformed. People are being forbidden to speak, and the young students are at least partially responsible. You can't deny no platforming takes place. And one very quick point, a rare defence of politicians, but I think journalists have been let off the hook. The number of times politicians are criticised, Maybot, they're being criticised for robotic language. The minute they say anything non-technocratic, there's this gotcha aspect of journalists where they go after them and make a huge, big scandal out of very little. You're not actually allowed to have binary thoughts anymore because the journalists will spin it.
Interesting. Nick, any views on whether us journalists are ruling the world?
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting that we kind of railing against elites. I mean, if Brendan isn't an elite, I mean, Brendan's had, I think, 3 cover features of The Spectator since I arrived kind of 18 months ago. And if Paul isn't an elite, as a top university professor and radio titan, I don't know what constitutes...
But a relation didn't get me the job.
I mean, but is that a prerequisite of being an elite?
It's one definition of not being part of an elite.
We're not here to discuss Paul,
but either way, this idea that you're rejecting the elite, well, the elite is rejecting the elite. I mean, Rachel touched upon it when she said Brexit. I don't agree on Brexit, but I just think that there's a kind of I think the left is obsessively hostile, and I see this when I book Brendan onto my podcast and I cannot find anyone to debate him, and it's just really frustrating because, it should be a good debate and no one wants to do it because they are all no platforming, which I think is completely self-destructive. And on the right, it's this weird hypocrisy to say, like, oh, calling out culture is bad, but Brendan's entire journalistic career is about calling people out for behaviour he doesn't like, and that's fine. I mean, you don't like the name that's been given by the left, but the act is the same, and it's just different labels that we're kind of debating here. And I think those are the kind of 2 positions that I think could be resolved slightly, but I don't think it's a crisis.
Brendan, 1 minute.
I agree with Rachel that crisis and doubt and confusion are not necessarily bad things, and they can, crisis is an opportunity in many ways. That's kind of what the word means. You can go one way or another. And they can give rise to dynamism and discussion. But the problem today is that that's not what is happening. It might be happening in this room, which is why the battle of ideas is so cool. But I don't see that dynamism in terms of ideas. I see the attempt to shut down ideas. I see the attempt to overturn democratic votes. I see the constant demonization and othering of people who have different views to you. So the dynamism is absent, in my view. And even the creation of new words and the creation of new language is very often, it can appear dynamic, but is very often an elite project that is fundamentally designed to control what other people can say and fundamentally how they can think about things. Very, very quickly on the elite, because that's come up a few times, the question of what's the elite. There's a lot of confusion around that as well. People think the elite is Donald Trump and Nigel Farage standing in a golden lift, or people who write for The Spectator or lecture at universities. The elite is a question of who has power and control over your life. So for ordinary people, the elite isn't necessarily bankers who are exceptionally wealthy. It can be the social worker who doesn't get paid very much but has the power to take your children away from you. Or it can be the pen pushers who will refuse to empty your rubbish if it isn't perfectly separated, which means you have disgusting rubbish outside your house. These are people who have control over your daily life, your family life, your home life. That can be an elite to people, even if those people only get paid £60,000 a year or something. So the question of what the elite is, for most people, and the thing that people are currently revolting against, it's a layer of society that has bureaucratic influence over your life that you would prefer they didn't have.
Interesting.
I was going to say that their names hadn't been mentioned, but Brendan just picked me to it in the last thing he said. I really liked your desire to reclaim populism. I mean, that's a great challenge, great idea. Two of the most successful people who are accused of populists are Trump and Farage, arguably two of the most successful politicians of their generation at the moment. Obviously, I have to make very clear to everybody in the room, I do not agree with the politics and the ideas of Donald Trump and Nigel Farage. But one of the things I have enjoyed as their rise over the last few years is their use of a political language to take on the established political language and cut through it. Now, some of that is to do with their arguments and their ideas and their policy positions, but part of it is also a total irreverence for, often, the established way you talk about politics. So is there anything there that, how do you develop our own irreverence for the established way that politics is discussed? And is there anything we can learn from the Trump-Farage approach to political language?
Very quickly.
I just wanted to sort of pick up on this point that was made about whether Brendan's sort of being a little reactionary. I share your distaste for the sort of banality of talking about your body parts, but in a moment like now where everything seems to be in flux, that's when, and it's always historically at moments of flux when you have these debates about the crisis of language, and your point about Socrates is very well made. But isn't it the essentially reactionary thing to say in a moment of flux, no, a man has to be this thing, or populism has to mean this thing? Isn't it essentially reactionary to try and fix things in place when actually now should be the moment where we could push things in a new direction?
Trans people exist. Why shouldn't we have a linguistic framework to deal with that? Even if the word cis is sometimes used for virtue signalling or witch hunting, or it was created supposedly by an elite, we still need it to be able to have discussions about trans issues, and we shouldn't get rid of it altogether.
Brenda, I mean, it was rich pickings, but I found the thing most difficult that you said about race. And I think that, it would be good. I think you were actually quite clear on what you thought was wrong with anti-racists and anti-racism as a term. But it'd be good if you could maybe just read that really short passage from your speech and we could debate it, because it's deeply flawed and really ignorant.
Okay, I'm not going to ask Brendan to reread his speech. Right, we're going to come back to us for some concluding comments.
So I think what we're finding is the crisis isn't in individual words at all. It's in the narratives that are attached to them. And I think that it's our ongoing job as dynamic, engaged individuals to continue questioning exactly what those words mean. The word elite has come up again and again. I would frankly like to ask for a ban on the word elite and ask every time somebody uses it to actually specify exactly who they're meaning at that point in time.
Brilliant, thanks Rachel. Paul?
I think I offered various definitions of elite. They all hold. I think the elite don't like being called out. Very quick point about Trump. I'd finish my comments by saying, remember the dog at the dinner party? Disliking the man intensely, but I remember there was an EU summit, not an EU, I think there's a European summit related to NATO, and Trump in front of Merkel and Macron basically said Germany and France haven't paid their fair share of defence spending for decades, which is true, and they looked visibly uncomfortable. So there is, within the existing political system, even a stopped clock is right twice a day, and even Donald Trump can be right, but these things need to be spoken out loud.
Cheers, Paul.
Sorry to break Rachel's ban on elites, but I mean the definitions of elite that we've offered are just so broad it becomes basically meaningless. And I think, this is really the closest we've come to actually discussing political language is when we talk about identity politics. And as has been pointing it out, these neologisms are responding to a new moment, and we do need a way of discussing them, because it's very difficult for people, even if they disagree with the idea of like trans identity, which is, is a take, I guess. They need a way of using that. We without the word trans, we can't discuss trans people, and without the word cis, we can't understand and engage in those arguments. So these are just new words that are emerging to fill new kind of concepts in our ideas about gender and stuff. And obviously we're going to have this discussion about postmodernism out by the fountain later. But these are real kind of debates that are happening, not just in universities, but in people's lives. And finding linguistic roots to actually like describe them is so important. And it isn't in crisis. It's a good thing. It's a positive thing.
I find this people's discomfort or their willingness to censor the use of the word elite, which I hear all the time now, absolutely fascinating, because what's actually happened over the past 18 months or so is that the elite has been exposed in a way that it hasn't happened in decades. Particularly by Brexit, but also by other electoral events around the world, where they've been exposed not only as being utterly disconnected from ordinary people. So you have a situation where 80% of MPs wanted to stay in the European Union, but 17.4 million, the largest number of voters in history, wanted to leave. I mean, the disconnect is gaping. It's historic. It's unprecedented. They've been exposed in that sense, but also they've been exposed the shallowness of their commitment to ideas like democracy. The shallowness of their commitment to the ideas of wanting to listen to people, that whole focus group culture they went through over the past decade, utterly exploded by their reaction to Brexit, which they despise and which they want to either overthrow or dilute. So they've been exposed in a way that it hasn't happened for a long time. I think that's wonderful, but I can see that that's precisely why they now say, oh, we're not the elite, stop saying the elite. If you say elite, you must be like the fascists who also talked about an elite. That's an example of the deeply censorious language we have, which is trying to mystify what's currently going on, which is that the people, sorry to use the phrase the people, but the people have confronted the elite and people feel uncomfortable with that. The final thing I wanted to say is that the key problem I think we face at the moment, and I bang my head against the brick wall about this all the time, is the emptying out, the hollowing out of very important words and ideas like progressive and democrat and radical. Those words now mean the opposite of what they used to mean, and that is a problem. People say to me all the time, how can you call yourself left-wing when you're anti-environmentalist and so obsessed with liberty? But Trotsky's definition of being a revolutionary was that you wanted to expand man's power over nature and decrease man's power over man. That is the definition of a properly progressive politics. And if you say that now, you're borderline fascist. This is how disorganized political language has become, and it does reflect a crisis of meaning, it does reflect a crisis of politics. I think we need a new language, we need new ideas, we need new substance. And to that end, going ahead, I think it's very difficult to call ourselves right or left because they mean the opposite of what they used to mean. We need new words, and I'm very happy to call myself a Brexiteer, very happy to call myself a populist, very happy to call myself a leaver. These are the new words, and I'm willing to run with them and try to give them as much meaning as possible.
Can I just quickly
Thank you. Our panel. Thank you.